If they were, we wouldn't need to ask the question, how can I tell if my child is alienated? We would know, my child is rejecting me, he or she must be alienated. But the truth is that although it's very rare for children to reject a parent, we do need to take into account that it's possible that a child who's rejecting a parent isn't alienated. They might be estranged. They might be rejecting a parent for justifiable reasons. And therefore, when we look at a child who's rejecting a parent, and that child is, I don't want to see my mom and dad, you can't make me, I don't want to see them, I just want them out of my life, we can't know based on their rejecting behavior. We can't know just based on that one piece of information whether that child is alienated or estranged. And the way that we can know is really the focus of my talk. What is the information that we need to look at to determine if the child is alienated or estranged? And the first point that I want to make is you have to look at the behavior of all of the parties, each of the parents and the child. You cannot make a decision or a determination that alienation is present just on the behavior of any one of the three parties. Before I jump into the identification process, I want to just talk for a minute about why it matters. Why does it matter if a rejecting child is alienated or estranged? And the answer is that this has implications for the legal and mental health systems. So from a legal point of view, if the child is estranged, then the child should not be mandated to go into treatment with the rejected parent, and the favored parent should not be sanctioned for not promoting parenting time. However, if the child is alienated, then the court should sanction the favored parent and should order the appropriate treatment to repair the relationship. From a mental health point of view, the treatment should fit the underlying condition. Children who are in treatment with an abusive parent should be in what we refer to as abuse-specific treatment. And abuse-specific treatment focuses primarily on helping the caregiver use non-punitive discipline strategies, and the treatment focuses on helping the child process the trauma from the abuse. If the child is alienated, the treatment should be alienation-specific and should focus on correcting the child's distorted thoughts and feelings about the targeted parent and providing opportunities for the child to experience the parent as safe, loving, and available. So I hope with those two little synopses you can see how very different abuse-specific treatment is from alienation-specific treatment. And that's why it's really important that the courts and the mental health systems get the identification right. And of course, it matters for you, the targeted parent, as well. If your child is rejecting you, you want to know, am I doing something that's contributing to this? Is it my behavior that's causing my child to reject me? Or is the other parent fostering my child's unjustified rejection of me? And that will have implications for how you approach your child, what you ask for of the court, and how you relate to the other parent. So the identification, the proper identification of alienation is really essential. So what I rely on is the four-factor model. And this takes into account the behaviors of all members of the family. It doesn't assume, oh, well, let's just look at one parent or the other parent or their child, and therefore we can tell if the child is alienated or not. All right, so the bulk of my talk is going to be going through the four-factor model. So the first factor is that there was a prior positive relationship between the child and the now rejected parent. And this, of course, takes into account that all parents are imperfect. This is a point we make in the field over and over again. All parents have normative flaws, even targeted parents. And generally, if the flaws are normative, they will not interfere in a child's ability or the parent's ability to form a loving attachment bond with the parent. So we want to see, is this parent a normative parent? Were they able to develop an attachment relationship with this child? So we're not asking if the rejected parent is a perfect parent, only whether the parent was capable of forming an attachment with the child. If they were, incredibly harsh or abusive or unavailable or disinterested in parenting. They were absent most of the time. They were systematically, pervasively unloving, unsafe, unavailable. And ultimately, if that child rejects that parent, we would say, no, there probably wasn't a prior positive relationship, and alienation isn't the cause of the child's rejection of that parent. Now, I want to weave in here a question that somebody asked about whether a child of any age can become alienated. And this model does presuppose that the child is at least 2 years of age in order to become alienated. Because before that, or I'd say maybe as young as 1, before that there isn't even an attachment relationship to become broken for the child to become alienated. Okay. Factor 2 is absence of abuse or neglect on the part of the now rejected parent. So again, we are looking at not whether this parent is a perfect parent, but did they engage in something so egregious that the child has a legitimate, reality-based reason for not wanting to spend time with that parent. And I do want to point out again something that we say over and over again, that even kids who have been abused, abandoned, neglected, molested, beaten, and burned generally do not reject a parent. There's mounting evidence now about the behavior and attitudes of abused kids that they really do not vehemently oppose contact with an abusive parent. However, if a child did, we would not call that child alienated. And to be clear, when I say absence of abuse or neglect on the part of the now rejected parent, we're not talking about allegations, accusations, innuendos, insinuations. We're talking about bona fide actual abuse or neglect. Because as we all know, false allegations of abuse or neglect pretty much go with the territory in alienation cases. Okay. So factor 3 is that the favored parent has engaged in multiple, many, does not have to be all, of the 17 primary parental alienation strategies. And these strategies were identified originally in some qualitative research I did, which involved interviewing adults who had been alienated as children and asking them through the research protocol, how did it happen that mom turned you against dad or dad turned you against mom? What did that parent do? How did they take you from loving that parent to becoming afraid or angry at that parent? And then I did another research study where I interviewed adults who were targeted parents who felt that the other parent was turning their child against them. And I asked them, well, what do you think the other parent is doing? And then putting those two pieces of information together, I developed this list of 17 primary parental alienation strategies. And then, not to get too researchy, but that list has been turned into a research tool that has now been replicated. It's been used in many, many, many different studies in New York and in Texas and in Italy, with teenagers, with college students, with graduate students, with parents, mothers, fathers, sons and daughters, just a whole variety of different samples. And consistently, this measure shows that these behaviors are alienation strategies, or what we refer to now as alienating behaviors, and now I'm going to go into them in some detail. Okay, so the first one is bad-mouthing or denigrating the other parent. And to be clear, we're not talking about a periodic negative comment from one parent to the other, or an eye roll, oh, I can't believe your dad is late picking you up again. You know, the truth is that all parents engage in this, or many parents engage in this. Even happily married couples are frustrated or disappointed that the other parent is doing something that they don't like. You know, nobody parents your child exactly the way you do. So that's not what we're talking about as a parental alienation strategy. We're talking about a steady stream of negative messaging that conveys to the child pretty much that everything that other parent does is stupid and wrong and contemptible and just worthy of contempt, worthy of thinking that other person just, basically can't do anything right. We're talking about exaggerating minor flaws and turning them into proof to the child that the other parent doesn't really love them and doesn't really care about them. So examples would be conflating the end of the marriage. Well, if Dad really loved us, he wouldn't have, broken up the family, or creating scenarios where no matter what that parent does, it's seen as bad or wrong, creating kind of a double bind situation. So, for example, a parent might encourage the child to say to the targeted parent, I don't want you coming to my soccer practice. You look weird the way you're in the stands there. Nobody likes you. Nobody wants you there. And if you really love and respect me, you won't come. So if the targeted parent, quote, loves and respects the child and listens to the child's voice and doesn't go to soccer practice, then the favorite parent could say, well, nothing could stop me from coming to the soccer practice. See, he really didn't care. If he really cared, he would have come. And if the targeted parent overrides the child's wish and says, look, I know you don't want me there, but you're too important for me to miss this. I'm going to show up. I won't bother you, but I'm going to be there. Then the favorite parent can say, look, that parent doesn't even respect you. They don't honor your voice and your wishes, and they can't really love you. So creating situations in which whatever that parent does can be looked at as bad. All right. That's the first of the 17 primary parental alienation strategies. The next one is limiting contact. This can be anything from picking up the kid a little bit early, dropping them off a little bit late, eroding. Anything that erodes parenting time would qualify, as long as there isn't a good explanation for it. So, for example, if this is a question that often I get asked on the stand. Well, the favorite parent schedules soccer practice for the kid on Wednesdays, and that's, Dad's parenting time. Isn't that limiting contact? Well, in that instance, it would really depend. If the kid is 3 and can take soccer practice any day of the week, then, yeah, scheduling it purposefully on the other parent's parenting time, absolutely. If the child is 15 and slated to go to college eventually and be a soccer star and the world-famous coach comes in and is only free on Wednesdays and that's the day, then no, it probably isn't an alienation strategy. So some of these things you really have to look at the context, what's happening in the family, and how it was negotiated between the two parents. But in general, behavior that erodes the other parent's time with the child could certainly be an example of limiting contact. And this is crucial. This is a key parental alienation strategy. That's why I put it as number 2, because with the bad-mouthing that we already talked about, the child is coming to have some question in his mind about whether the targeted parent really loves him, is really safe, is really caring about him. And then if there's less and less time that they spend together, there's fewer opportunities for the targeted parent to show him or herself to be safe, to be loving, and to be available. And when this is taken to an extreme where the time they have together is less and less and less and less, eventually what happens is that from the child's point of view, spending time with that other parent becomes almost anomalous, like an inconvenience or an intrusion into their quote-unquote real life. And so the child can then, on his or her own, decide that they don't really want to spend time with that parent because it feels weird to spend time with somebody that isn't really an integral part of your life. The other element to limiting contact is that children really live in the moment. When they burst through, out of the school bus at the end of the day, they're either ecstatic because they aced their math test, or they're totally bummed because they didn't get to play the game they wanted to play in the playground. And the parent who's there, the parent who spends time with the child, that's the parent who helps the child make meaning of their lives. And one of the things that alienating parents do, and this will come up later in another alienation behavior, but I'm going to link it now to limiting contact, is these favorite parents want to be the most important person to the child. They want their opinion, their worldview to be the only worldview that the child has. And so if that parent spends more time with the child, if they're the one catching the child when they're ecstatic or despondent, they get to help the child make meaning of their experiences. And alienating parents, because they want to be the most important person in the child's life, often will encourage the child to think less of other people. So, oh, your math teacher didn't give you a good grade? Well, they're a terrible math teacher. You don't have to be nice to them anymore. Oh, Sally didn't invite you to a sleepover? Cross her off your list. There's a pervasive sort of cutting off of other people. And so the parent, again, who spends the most time with the child, can put their stamp on the child's experiences. Okay, the next one is interfering with communication. So obviously, that's not sharing cell phone numbers, being in the room when the child is talking to the other parent so the child feels inhibited, or putting the calls on speakerphone, not passing on cell phone numbers, not passing on email. Any way that a child and parent could communicate is cut off. And, as we all know, face-to-face, skin-to-skin, eye-to-eye contact is the most important, meaningful contact for developing and establishing and maintaining an attachment bond. There's nothing like looking in your child's eyes and telling them how much you love them. But if you're separated, talking on the phone or texting or WhatsApping or whatever the latest is can feel connective. And it's really important for that connection to be maintained. Otherwise, parents are going long periods of time without hearing about their child's life. And we know if you miss even a day, if you ask a child on the phone, what did you do yesterday in school, you are most likely going to get, I don't know, I don't remember, whatever. So you want to have that ongoing communication, and alienating parents are a sort of genius at interrupting and interfering and making it difficult. The fourth parental alienation behavior that I'm going to talk about is interfering with symbolic communication. This means thinking about, talking about, or looking at pictures of somebody. And that's, if you're not face-to-face with them, if you're not talking to them on the phone, the only way to have a relationship then is in your mind. And, when I give talks in person, I will ask everybody in the audience, raise your hand if you have a picture of your loved one on your phone. It's your spouse, your kids, your dog, whatever. Pretty much everybody raises their hand. And I say, keep your hand up if it's your screensaver, your home page on your phone. And pretty much everybody will keep their hand up. And then I say, keep your hand up if you looked at your photo album in the last 24 hours at pictures of your loved ones. And pretty much everybody keeps their hand up. And then I will ask, did you forget what your children look like? Did you forget what your spouse looks like? Of course not. That's not why we look at pictures of people we love. And again, if I'm doing this live with people in a room, I'll ask them, how do you feel when you look at a picture of your loved one? And they will call out words like safe, loving, loved, close, connected, warm. These are wonderful, positive feelings we have just at looking at a picture of somebody we love. And it does help keep the attachment alive. And the truth is, if you're not spending time with somebody and you're not talking to them on the phone and you're not looking at pictures of them, well, guess what? You don't have a relationship with that person. And so alienating parents make it very hard for kids to have this kind of symbolic communication with the targeted parent. They don't, generally, alienated kids don't feel comfortable having photographs of the other parent on their phone. They don't feel comfortable talking about that other parent. They don't even feel comfortable thinking about that other parent because they know that the alienating parent will be upset with them. Okay, so that was number 4. Number 5 is withdrawal of love and approval when the child shows positive attention or affection or interest in the targeted parent. So alienating parents can be extremely affectionate and intensely connected to the child, almost in a, or not just almost, but sometimes in an enmeshed way where it's very, very, very close and intimate. and kids become used to that kind of level of intimacy with that parent, and they generally get it, except if they show love and interest and affection towards the targeted parent, and then the alienating parent withdraws that intense approval and affection and love, and the child unconsciously, I don't think they're aware of it, come to feel, Dad only loves me when or Dad doesn't love me when I show interest in Mom. It's something that happens under the surface. If you ask them, consciously, kid, do you think Dad wants you to not love Mom? The kid would probably say, no, it's fine. But they're experiencing that withdrawal of love sort of underneath their experiencing. Okay, number 6 is telling the child that the targeted parent doesn't love him or her. This is just a very specific form of bad-mouthing that I don't need to spend a lot of time on, but obviously it is very, very damaging if the alienating parent interprets all the normative flaws and even normative non-flawed behavior of the targeted parent as proof that the child is not loved. The next one is forcing or allowing the child to choose. So this involves creating situations in which the child comes to believe that parenting time with the other parent is optional. It's not mandatory, it's voluntary, it's a choice that they have, and it's not even a particularly good choice. It's creating situations in which the child is very likely to want to choose not to be with that other parent. Creating the impression the targeted parent is dangerous, again, just another form of bad-mouthing, but one that is very, very damaging, because if the child really feels unsafe, then they are going to want to stay away from that parent. And at some point, I think we all have seen this in cases where at some point the favored parent can step back and stop engaging in any of these behaviors, and the child will want nothing to do with the other parent, because the fear and the anger and the hatred and the contempt already lives inside the child. And the alienating parent can say, hey, this isn't me. I'm okay. The parent, my child can go to that other parent. But if the child thinks they're going to be hurt or harmed or killed or in danger in some way, of course they're going to resist contact. Okay, the next one is confiding in the child. This is telling the child information, often unflattering information, personal, private, unflattering information about the targeted parent, and obviously confiding in the child about the legal case, and often done in a way that flatters the child, so the child feels very proud of themselves. And so the favored parent will say things like, well, your mom doesn't think you're mature enough to understand this, or your mom, is such a fool, is listening to the judge. I'm not going to let anybody tell me what I can talk to my child about. Of course I'm going to tell you. You deserve to know. This is your life. This is your divorce. You should know everything that's going on. And, of course, oftentimes this confiding is highly skewed information that's being provided to the child. The child thinks he wants to know. It feels good to be seen as trustworthy and mature and worthy of being shared information with. But in the end, of course, it's overwhelming and confusing. And oftentimes the targeted parent doesn't even know that the child's being confided in. They don't have an opportunity to try to correct the record. And of course, when they do, that generally backfires anyway, because it's too late. The child already has an idea of what's what and what's happening in court. And it's hard to undo that first idea. Okay, the next one is forcing the child to reject the targeted parent. So examples of this include having the child call or write or email the targeted parent saying, I don't want you to come to my Sweet 16 party. I don't care if you paid for my bat mitzvah. I don't want you there. Don't do this with me. Don't do that with me. And this is so important because if the parent listens and doesn't do the thing that they're being told they're not supposed to do, as I said earlier, they then look like they don't really care. But also, if they're being told this from the child, it's likely that they're going to get angry at the child. That's their first reaction. What do you mean I can't do? Why are you telling me this? Well, of course I want to come to this or that, your play, your band practice, your playoffs, whatever. It's very disorienting for the parent to be rejected this way and to have their child so empowered that the child thinks that they have a right to tell the parent what to do. It can be very disturbing for the parent, and if they react with sort of a normal sense of like outrage and upset, it reinforces the negative idea the child has that that parent doesn't love them or is a bully or mean or crazy. So a lot of these alienating behaviors work to create conflict between the child and the targeted parent. So they work not only by limiting contact or all the other things I've already talked about, giving the child false information, but it also, in the moment, reinforces the idea that the targeted parent is unsafe, unloving, and unavailable. And of course, this one in particular reinforces the idea that the child has a right to boss this parent around and tell them what they can and cannot come to. Okay, the next one is asking the child to spy on the targeted parent. So oftentimes in divorce situations, one parent would like to know what's going on in the other parent's home. Do they have a new boyfriend or girlfriend? Did they get a new job? Did they get a bonus? Do they have a new lawyer? There's all sorts of information that parents are curious about, or maybe even more than curious. They really, have a vested interest in wanting to know. And of course, if the child isn't totally alienated, that child is going back and forth, and they have access to what's happening in the other parent's home. And so a parent might say, well, just take a picture on your phone and send it to me of whatever. And this is a betrayal of the trust, and the child knows that they're betraying the trust of the other parent. And whether or not the targeted parent finds out, and if they do find out, again, they will be hurt and angry, and they will most likely respond with hurt and anger, and that most likely will reinforce the idea that that parent is unsafe, unloving, and unavailable. But even if the targeted parent doesn't find out, the child will feel most likely guilty because they know they've betrayed a trust. Otherwise, they wouldn't be sneaking around. So when a child betrays the trust of a parent, it is natural to want to avoid that parent so that they're not found out, or just to avoid the guilty feeling of being with somebody whose trust you betrayed. So in a way, this strategy kind of reinforces some of the other strategies of wanting the child to spend less time with the targeted parent. On a related note, the next one is asking the child to keep secrets from the targeted parent. All right, and again, let me start with an example. So a typical example is where the alienating parent will say to the child, I want to get you X, a new puppy, a trip to Disney World, whatever. But, your other parent won't want you to do it, and they're going to try to take that away from you. So just keep it a secret, and we'll do it, and then you won't have a problem. And it might even be like, I want to take you to Disney World, but it has to fall on the other parent's parenting time. So let's just book the trip, but don't tell, your mom that you're going to Disney World. But then the next time the child goes and hangs out with mom, the child's going to feel guilty. If they're a normal human being, they're going to have feelings of guilt or shame, and they're going to worry that they're going to get caught. It's hard to keep a secret, and the likely response in the child will be to want to avoid that the targeted parent. And if the targeted parent finds out, their likely response is hurt and anger. How dare you keep this secret from me? How dare you, as I mentioned earlier, spy on me? The other thing that happens with these two behaviors, the spying and the secret, is that when children do something bad, betraying the trust of another parent, they don't want to feel that they are bad people themselves. I did this bad thing. That must make me a bad person. So what they do is they find a way to make it not a bad thing. Well, if mom didn't, if mom would just share information with dad, then I wouldn't have to spy. Or if mom would just let me go to Disney World, I wouldn't have to keep this secret. So they turn it around in their head to blame the targeted parent, to blame the parent they're keeping secrets from and spying on, so that they can say to themselves, yeah, I'm not such a bad kid. I was doing a good thing. I wasn't hurting a good parent. They're really a crummy parent. So I don't have to feel badly that I did this. So again, it reinforces that bad-mouthing message that the other parent is a bad parent. Okay, the next one is referring to the targeted parent by his or her first name, in front of the child, to the child, and encouraging the child to do it to the parent. And one of the things I've kind of come to understand is in most, and it might even be all, human cultures, kids have a special name for their parents. And usually it starts with the letter M and D, M for mom and D for dad in our culture, in the English language, but it's in other languages as well. And that's because the syllables M and D are spontaneously the first syllables that most infants make. And so parents shape that babbling. When a baby says, mama, 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 the parent says, yes, I'm your mommy. And the infant goes, da, 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 yes, I'm your daddy. And we shape those syllables into words that have meaning ultimately for the kid. And I think there's a reason for this, about why children have special names. I think there might even be an evolutionary advantage. So if a kid is in danger and calls out, Amy, only one person's going to turn around, but if it's mommy, maybe all the women would turn around, and then there'd be more people likely to help the baby. I don't know, or child. I'm not sure that's the reason, but in any event, in our society, we do have these names, mom and dad, and it connotes both affection and it connotes responsibility. Who's the mom of Johnny? Johnny got hurt on the playground. Who's his mom? Right? So there's a sort of a shortcut for who's the person who's responsible for this kid. That's another meaning packed into those words. And when let's say a mom starts referring to dad by his first name to the child instead of dad, so saying, oh, John is here. It's time for you to go to John's for the weekend. Rather than Dad's here, it's time to go to Dad's. When a parent does that, without explicitly saying so, that parent is conveying to the child that person is no longer a special person who has special privileges and authority over you. They are no more important to you than anybody else you refer to by their first name. And if you're a parent on the receiving end of this, it can be quite a shocker to have your child refer to you by your first name. You feel it intuitively that you have been demoted, that you were being told by your child, you are not a person of authority and privilege in my life. And again, the targeted parent on the receiving end of this is very likely to respond with hurt and anger. What the heck? Why are you calling me by my first name? And maybe even stronger than what the heck. And then that reinforces in the child, mom's right, dad is really a meanie. Or dad's right, mom is really crazy. Look at how she's reacting. I'm just using this name. Who cares? No big deal. So it's a very, very, very powerful alienating behavior. And I want to pause for a moment and say any one of these alone may seem, especially let's say to a custody evaluator or a therapist or a judge, as just a minor, not such a great thing, but no big deal. And so part of what I think needs to happen in terms of educating other people about identifying alienation is really explaining the underlying process that happens when these behaviors are occurring. So a judge might think, all right, so mom calls dad by his first name. Why does that matter? Well, the judge needs to understand it very much matters. This child is being given the message that person isn't even a parent anymore. They're basically being, demoted from being a parent, which is the most important person in a child's life, to, just anybody else, any of the other millions of people in the world. It's a very big deal. Okay. The next one is referring to a step-parent as mom or dad and encouraging the child to do the same. So this is basically installing a replacement parent for the child, and it goes hand in hand. So first, the targeted parent is demoted. They're now not mom or dad. They're, Shirley or Jack. And now there's a new person who is mom or dad. And I've seen this happen so fast. I've worked on cases where within 6 weeks of the dad moving out, a new guy is in, and the kids are using that guy's last name as their last name, or they're referring to him as dad. I've actually expanded my conceptualization, my understanding of this strategy, that this isn't just about the names. It's about conveying to the child that there is a replacement. So again, I worked on a case where it wasn't about names per se, but the favorite parent installed a team of people. So she called it Team Nikki because the kid's name was Nikki. And it was all men, an uncle and a coach and a mentor, a team of men. And eventually Nikki said, I don't need my dad, I have my team. So no, she didn't call anybody dad on her team, but she was being given the message these people are replacing your dad. So for this one, it's not so much just about the name, it's about installing somebody as a replacement and conveying to the child, you don't need you don't need the targeted parent. There's somebody else who can do everything that targeted parent did. Okay, the next one is withholding medical, social, or academic information and not providing the targeted parent's information on school forms, academic forms, etc. So it's basically making it very hard for the targeted parent to be involved in the child's life, to be called in if there's an emergency, to know what's happening, when is the soccer, game schedule. That parent has to work 10 times harder just to know all the basic information. And then, if they miss information because they're not on the coach's email list, and so they don't know that the practice field changed or the game is here or there or whatever, and then they don't show up, then the favorite parent can say, see, if, your mom really cared, she would have shown up. I know when everything is. I show up, that person doesn't. And that seems plausible to a child. They don't know how hard it can be to get the accurate information. Okay, I think we have 2 more. So the next one is changing a child's name to remove association with the targeted parent. So oftentimes moms will do this by using their maiden name as the kid's last name, just suddenly starting to do that. Or dads do it by coming up with new nicknames for the kid. And the kids act as if, of course, I've always been called JoJo, or I always use mom's last name. They, for whatever reason, they're just buying into the mythology of the family that the favorite parent is perpetrating. And again, it can be very, very disconcerting for a parent to have to start using a new name to refer to their child when that name eliminates them out of the picture. So, they're in a really tough position because if they refuse to do it, then they're going to be fighting and in conflict with their kid. And if they agree to do it, then they're participating in their own marginalization. It's a very, I would say, cruel position to put a parent in. And the last one is undermining the authority of the targeted parent. So this is putting down their rules and regulations, creating scenarios where the child will violate the rules and regulations of that other parent. Anything that promotes the favored parent as the most important, the only parent whose rules and regulations matter, fall into this category. So I've worked on cases where a kid will call, staying at the targeted parent's house, will call the favorite parent every morning, what should I wear today, my blue shirt or my green shirt? Should I wear this dress or that dress, these pants or that pants? And the targeted parent is sitting right there, right? Or they're right in the same house, but the child believes that the only parent who should have a say, the only parent whose opinions matter, is the favored parent. All right, so those are the 17 primary parental alienation strategies. So I wanted to pause for a moment. Somebody asked a question about whether it's alienation if a parent empowers a child to make decisions. And I think that I actually talked about this a little bit earlier, that like a lot of these behaviors, it very much matters what the context is. So it certainly could be if a child makes a decision to, not have parenting time, and if there is a set schedule and there, the parents are supposed to follow the schedule, then empowering the child to say, I don't feel like coming to my parenting time, certainly would be an example of alienation. However, if the parenting arrangement is loose, and I've seen this in some cases where there is no fixed plan and allowing the child to choose is built in, then no, it wouldn't be an alienation strategy. So it very much depends on the context. But all else being equal, giving a child a choice that involves limiting the quality or quantity of the relationship with the targeted parent would probably be an alienation strategy. And the other thing about this is a lot of times we talk about choice as if it's a real choice, allowing the child to choose. But in my experience with alienation cases, there's really only one choice the child knows they have to make, and that's to choose to be with the favored parent. If it were truly an authentic choice, where sometimes the child said, I want to spend extra time with dad this weekend, next weekend I feel like spending extra time with mom, and if on balance it works out and both parents are okay with it, no, not alienation. But if the choice is pretty much in quotes, and we all know, and the child knows what the real and only choice is, then yes, that would probably be alienation. Okay, another person asked whether it's alienation if a parent chooses somebody else to take care of the children instead of the targeted parent. And again, I hate to be a broken record, but it depends on context. If there is a right of first refusal in the parenting plan, then the favored parent is engaging in limiting contact between the child and the targeted parent by relying on somebody else when the child's supposed to actually be with the targeted parent. But if there's no right of first refusal, it really could be alienation, but it doesn't have to be. It would depend on how often it's happening, what is being conveyed to the child, what's everybody's understanding of the meaning of this. So I'm sorry that I can't be more specific than that. So these 17 strategies work by furthering the child's cohesion and alignment with the alienating parent. The child comes to feel that the alienating parent is the only one, the only true, the only good, the only reliable, the only real parent. The strategies or these alienating behaviors create psychological distance between the child and the targeted parent. They're not spending time together. They're not necessarily thinking about or communicating with each other while apart. There's also an intensification of the targeted parent's anger and hurt. What do you mean I can't come to this? What do you mean you're calling me by my first name? What do you mean your new name is this? Constant feeling of being attacked and undermined. And as a result, these alienating behaviors cause conflict between the child and the targeted parent. Pretty much no matter what the targeted parent does as a reaction, whether it's to become depressed and demoralized or angry and reactive, whatever the response is, it's likely to cause trouble between them and the child. And that's why at some point the alienating parent can step back and say, hey, you can go visit if you want. I'm not getting involved. And it doesn't matter because the child's alienated. They don't want to visit. They've already internalized the distorted thoughts and feelings that the targeted parent is, unsafe, unloving, and unavailable. Okay, so that's the third factor. Now I'm going to talk about the fourth factor, which is that the child exhibits many, usually all, of the 8 behavioral manifestations of alienation. So the first one is the campaign of denigration. So this has many elements to it, the first of which is obviously vehement rejection of the targeted parent. Absolute disdain, contempt, lack of interest in that relationship. And I like to think about it as, one way to think about it is past, present, and future. So if you ask an alienated child to think about the past, can you tell me any good times you had with this parent? Think about some of the good things that you guys did together. The child will generally, an alienated child, will deny ever having good experiences with that parent. It's very extreme. One of my studies, we actually interviewed alienated kids, and we would ask them, tell me one good memory you have of the parent that they're now rejecting. And they couldn't. And in fact, not only would they say nothing, but they would write the word nothing with like 13 exclamation points on the paper. There's nothing good. I can't remember one good time ever, 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 ever. And this is very different even from kids who have been abused, abandoned, beaten, molested, etc. They will remember good times. They will say things like, oh, Mom was great before she went on crack. We had so much fun together. But only alienated kids will feign to remember nothing good about that parent. So that's the past. And it's so extreme that I've worked in cases where we've shown kids pictures of them looking like they're happy, having a good time, relaxed with the targeted parent. And they will say things like, that's not me, that's Photoshopped. They will not admit it. Oh, yeah, that was a good time. Or they'll say, well, Dad said he would pinch me if I didn't smile for the camera. Or they'll say, that was 1 second I smiled, but the other, million seconds I was miserable with that parent. They will not admit that they ever had a good time with that parent. So that's the past. The present is the adamant, vehement rejection, often hostile, rude, empowered. These kids are very, very nasty often towards the targeted parent. And the future. If you ask these kids, what could Mom do to fix this relationship? Or what could Dad do? How could he fix this? What would need to change? These kids will say things like, nothing. There's nothing this parent could do. I don't ever want to have this relationship in my life. They're not at all invested in any kind of reparation. And this is very different from kids who have been abused, abandoned, beaten, etc., who are generally desperate to have a reparation in the relationship and say things like, well, just tell Mom to stop drinking or tell Dad to stop being so mean, and then I want to be with him again. They want to repair the relationship. It seems to be only alienated kids who are so adamant in their negativity. It's almost like they enjoy being in this negative space and they have no interest in the relationship. And I'll just tell you a quick story. I saw this with my own eyes on a video of a teenage girl talking to her dad, and she said, Dad, it's like this. If I had a watch and the watch was an old watch and it broke, I would say, oh, well, and I would just throw it away. And that's how I feel about you. When you die, I'll just say, oh, well, no big deal. There's nothing that could fix the watch, and there's nothing that can fix you. So this is obviously a very cruel, callous, extreme kind of statement for a child to make towards a parent, towards anybody. Okay, the second of the 8 behavioral manifestations of alienation is weak, frivolous, and absurd reasons for the campaign of denigration. So if you ask an alienated child, what is the deal? You used to live with Mom and Dad, and then you spent lots of time with both parents, and now you won't even spend any time with your mom? Like, why? What did she do? The reasons these kids give are so disproportionate. That is the key word, disproportionate to whatever the flaws are. And just to go back to what I was saying much earlier, all parents are imperfect. All parents frustrate, hurt, disappoint, and upset their children. You could argue that even the best of parents, that it's a hallmark of being a good parent, that you cannot possibly gratify every desire of your child. But if you ask an alienated child, why don't you want to spend any time, any whatsoever, with that parent? The reasons they give are so weak and so frivolous and so absurd and so disproportionate. So examples are, Dad slurps his soup. Mom wears cowboy boots with her skirt. Or Mom dyed her hair orange. Or Dad serves me spicy foods. Or Dad made me go to Disney World. Or look at how Dad's slouching in his chair. I think my favorite in terms of frivolity is Dad's car smells like coffee and the wooden floors in his house are scratched. So obviously, these are not reasons why any child would be even remotely upset, let alone want nothing to do with a parent. Okay, the third is lack of ambivalence about the alienating parent. So it is a truism of development that children, and this is true of adults too, most humans have mixed feelings about pretty much everybody in their life. And the more close you are to the person, the more likely you are to have mixed feelings, because the more important they are to you and the more likely it is that they will, that their minor flaws will upset you. So even kids can have a best friend, but they don't like everything about that best friend. And they can have a favorite coach, but they don't like everything about the coach. They have a favorite teacher. They don't like everything about that teacher. And generally, kids have mixed feelings about their parents. Even kids who've been maltreated can see good and bad in each parent. But only alienated kids see the favored parent as all good and the targeted parent as all bad, even though objectively speaking, each parent has good and bad. It's like they have blinders on and they can only see the bad in one parent and only see the good in another. And in fact, as an extreme, I worked on a case where the kid was asked to draw pictures of both parents, and the kid literally drew a devil for the targeted parent and an angel for the alienating parent. And I've worked on cases where, again, objectively speaking, the favored parent has done some pretty egregious things. For example, not taking the child to the hospital when the kid broke his hand and was in agony because she went out to dinner. But that kid still gave the favored parent a free pass. No matter what that parent did, it was good because that parent did it. And no matter what the targeted parent did, it was bad because the targeted parent did it. Very, very different from what's normal and even what is typical of abused kids. Okay, the fourth one we refer to as the independent thinker phenomenon. And this means that these kids will go out of their way to proclaim to be completely not being influenced at all by the favored parent. So they will say things like, I know you think that mom had something to do with this, but I came up with this all on my own. Or kids who say, I have free will. I've seen this over and over again. Even 8-year-olds. I saw a letter written by an 8-year-old that said, Dear Kevin, because he was writing to his dad, using his first name, I have free will, and I've decided I never want to see you again. And I think they do this because it's so obvious that they're being coached and manipulated, and they know that that's what everybody thinks, so they're going out of their way to preemptively make it seem as if they're not. Okay, the fifth is borrowed scenarios. These are instances where the child uses phrases and ideas straight out of the mind and mouth of the favored parent, even when the child doesn't know what they're saying, they can't define the words, like the child who said, Daddy touched my vagina, and the therapist asked, I think this was Richard Gardner gives this example, well, what is that? I don't know, but Daddy did it and it's wrong. I worked on a case where the dad started to refer to the mother as trailer trash, which she was not. She was very cultured, very educated, wealthy. It made no sense. It was completely unrelated to reality. But lo and behold, the kids start referring to her as trailer trash as well. So it's borrowing an idea, a phrase, usually a negative connotation about the targeted parent, and then using it as if they came up with it themselves when clearly they didn't. Okay, the sixth of the 8 behaviors is absence of guilt or lack of remorse about the really, really, really terrible treatment of the targeted parent. So sometimes when people ask me, well, what's this alienation thing? And I want to give them a shorthand, I'll say alienation is where one parent gives the child permission to break the other parent's heart. And that is, as you all know, if you're targeted parents on the phone today or you work with them, this is basically, one of the worst things that can happen to a parent, short of the, death or severe, disease or disability of a child. This is the worst thing. And these kids are incredibly cruel, heartless, very, very cold, rude, arrogant, entitled. I think I don't have to go on. All how callous these kids can behave. And they appear, and I say appear because I know from my research later that for the kids who grow out of this and they figure it out, they look back and they feel tremendously guilty at what they did. But in the moment when they are alienated, they do not appear to have any compunction about what they're doing. And again, as a point of contrast, kids who have been beaten, abandoned, molested, etc., from a parent, and when they're in these abuse-specific treatments that I talked about earlier, when they're in those treatments, these kids are very careful, generally. I'm not saying every single one, every single moment, but in general, they need help setting appropriate limits. Mom, please don't, do it. Please don't do this to me anymore. Please don't do that to me anymore. I don't want to hurt your feelings. They're very, very aware that they don't want to hurt the feelings of the parent who hurt them. Unlike alienated kids who they act as if they don't care at all about the feelings of a parent who really hasn't done anything to them. So it's quite a contrast. Okay, the 7th of the 8 behavioral manifestations is reflexive support for the alienating behavior. So no matter what the conflict is, whether it's a scheduling conflict or something else, who's going to pay for this or who's going to pay for that, whatever it is, once the child's been confided in, so going back to the 17 strategies, once the child's been confided in and has the alienating parent's point of view about what it is, they will take that parent's side no matter how bizarre, no matter how crazy, no matter how illogical, even if it hurts them, their own best interest or self-interest, they will side automatically, reflexively with the alienating parent no matter what. It's like, that is the truth, and that's the only truth, and that's the way it's going to be. There's a kind of closed-mindedness that these kids have that is very extreme. And the 8th is the spread of animosity. So ultimately, the child becomes not only alienated from the targeted parent, but from a whole set of friends, families, neighbors, formerly beloved, grandparents, aunts and uncles and cousins. Everybody is cut off in what Richard Warshak calls tribal warfare. And it makes sense because the favorite parent doesn't want the kid exposed to anybody who would give them an alternative point of view, who would say, listen, kid, your dad's not so bad. What's going on here? Or I remember it differently. So from the alienating parent's point of view, it makes a lot of sense. It doesn't completely make sense from the child's point of view, but they buy into it because that's what they're being told from the person they are now completely reliant on, that this is the way it has to be. All right, so that's the four-factor model. I just want to recap that in order to identify a rejecting child as an alienated child, we need to see that there was a prior positive relationship, not that the parent was perfect, but that the parent and child had a loving attachment bond, that the now rejected parent did not engage in bona fide abuse or neglect, again, not that they were perfect, but that their flaws are normative flaws. The third factor is that the favored parent is engaged in multiple alienating behaviors. And the fourth factor is that the child is exhibiting these 8 behavioral manifestations of alienation. If you see all 4 of these, it is most likely alienation and not estrangement. And again, to recap, going back for a moment to the 8 behavioral manifestations, children who have been abused do not reject the abusive parent. Rather, they blame themselves for the abuse. They do not proudly and widely discuss the abuse the way that alienated kids talk about how disgusting and horrible the rejected parent is. They don't deny positive aspects of the relationship or negate the past. They don't worship one parent and despise the other. They don't reject the extended family of the abusive parent. So in every way, alienated kids and abused kids behave very, very, very differently. So now what I want to do, I think I have about 45 minutes left, is I want to go through some of the questions that did not easily fall into the topic that I already covered. So hopefully I've covered some of the questions, all the questions about is it alienation when this happens, is it alienation when that happens. But now I'm going to try to go through some of the other questions. So somebody asked, how to tell the difference between normal teenage rebellion and alienation? And the answer is the 4-factor model. And by the way, even teenagers don't exhibit the kind of extreme behavior in terms of idealizing one parent while demonizing the other. So again, if you were just looking at, is this child, acting rebellious and angry, maybe you couldn't tell whether this is developmental rebellion or alienation. But if you go through the 4 factors, it should be much easier to think about it from that perspective. Somebody else asked if it's alienation if a child refuses to visit. And the answer is that if that's the only behavior, the child is having some visitation refusal but nothing else, and there's no evidence that the favored parent is engaging in alienation behavior, it's probably not alienation. You'd have to look at, well, what else is going on? What's a plausible explanation for a child refusing to visit? And how are they refusing? Somebody asked me about using William Burnett's measure of splitting to identify alienation. And I don't know if Bill's on the phone or not, but maybe when we're all done, he can chime in. But what I wanted to say is I think that the person is referring to the Parental Alienation and Rejection Questionnaire. It's a measure called PARC. This measure was developed by Ronald Rohner, who's a sort of world-famous classic researcher who developed the measure and has used it around the world to look at this one aspect of parent-child relationships, which is the child's experience of being accepted or rejected by a parent. And Bill Burnett did a wonderful paper using that measure. But that measure only looks at the child's behavior and only one element of the child's behavior, which is lack of ambivalence. So I would not be comfortable, and I don't think Bill is saying that it would be appropriate to just use that one measure to identify whether a child is alienated or not. You would still want to see all 4 factors, are they present? Somebody asked about hybrid case and whether I could define it. And so hybrid is the term that we use for a case in which both parents are contributing to the child's rejection of a parent and the child is aligned with the other. And so it could be a case where the favored parent is using some alienation behaviors and the targeted parent has some very serious suboptimal parenting that has contributed to the child's disaffection. And these are real cases. They do happen. I don't think they happen quite as often as some custody evaluators and judges would like to think they happen. And the reason why this is such a popular sort of fallback position, as I've seen it in looking at custody evaluation reports, is that it's easy to conclude, let's just leave things alone. It's a hybrid, because if both parents are to blame, then why not just let the kid choose who they want to be with? And if the kid's already happy with one parent, then the hybrid wouldn't lead one to say we've got to impose sanctions and we've got to force, a parental alienation specialized immersion program. And so in my experience, many custody evaluators kind of love the hybrid model because it means that they don't really have to recommend anything that would be too uncomfortable for the judge. Because, again, in my experience, judges like to leave things alone rather than to do something that they perceive as risky in terms of sanctioning a parent or forcing the parent, forcing the child and the targeted parent into treatment. So I think the hybrid is wildly popular because it sort of helps everybody stay safe. Everybody's a little bit to blame. It means nobody has to really get outside their comfort zone. So, yes, it exists, but I think that it's overused because the four-factor model isn't being used. So if you ask the question, is the rejected parent perfect, or is there some things they've done that make the child uncomfortable, the answer is always going to be yes, because no parent's perfect. And if you think that that's what a hybrid model is, that parent A is engaging in alienation and parent B is imperfect, then you would see every case as a hybrid. But that's not technically what a hybrid is supposed to be. So I think that's what I have to say about hybrids. Okay, a question was asked about whether it's possible for a teenager to become alienated, and the answer is a resounding yes. I think it's interesting how many people ask this question, and I think it's because we have this idea that teenagers are savvy and kind of impervious to being manipulated, but we know from brain imaging research that the human brain is not fully developed into the mid-20s, I think roughly 25. And the teenage brain is underdeveloped in very specific ways that make them susceptible to emotional manipulation and impulsive decision-making. So they're probably more likely to become alienated than younger kids. And I think that many favorite parents know that once kids reach a certain age, the courts will give more weight to their preference in the best interest of the child statutes. And so it's possible that favorite parents step up their alienation strategies as the kid becomes a teenager. So in that sense, it would be more likely that a teenager would become alienated because they're being exposed to more alienation pressure. And of course, just to put this in sort of common sense, teenagers are the ones who, have unprotected sex and drink and drive and can be truant and use drugs and have peer pressure and gangs and bullying. I mean, there's all sorts of evidence that teenagers really are not fully developed in their brain and are susceptible to all sorts of manipulation. Alienation is just one example of that. Okay, somebody asked whether 50-50 custody can help forestall alienation from occurring. And I have to say I'm not aware of any research. If somebody knows a research study, I would love to read it. I think that intuitively it makes sense to people, well, if I have more time with my kid, then I have more opportunities to show myself to be safe, loving, and available. And I think I can't really argue with that, but I can say that I worked on one study of severely alienated kids, or the parents of severely alienated kids, and the vast majority of the parents had 50-50 custody. They just, obviously it wasn't being effectuated. So maybe it's helpful because it gives you more time with your child, but there's absolutely no evidence that it can prevent it, like, oh, well, as long as I have 50-50, I don't have to worry my kid can never become alienated. That is definitely not true. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cough here. Then there was a question about whether a bond between a parent and child or grandparent and child can be broken. And, of course, it depends on what we mean by broken. I don't think that attachment bonds are really binary. It's not like on or off, yes or no. Once there is a bond between a parent and a child, it can become corrupted. It can become interfered with. But I don't think there's evidence to conclude that it's completely broken, because a lot of these kids come around eventually. And so I don't think they would come around if there wasn't an attachment for them in their minds and hearts that led them to want to reinstate contact with the parent. I think more often or more likely what we're talking about is that the child has distorted thoughts and feelings about the targeted parent or grandparent if somebody else, and the child can come to believe that that parent is unsafe, unloving, and unavailable. But that doesn't seem to mean that the bond is completely broken. As I said, because so many alienated kids come back and reconnect with the rejected parent, that says to me that the bond is still present, even though it may be corrupted or attenuated. Now, please remember that I'm not commenting on any specific situation. I don't know any of the details of the question that was, from the person who was asking this question, but that's my general overall sense. And certainly when I interviewed people for my first book, Adult Children of Parental Alienation Syndrome, all of those people held in their heart that attachment with the rejected parent, and that's what led them to want to reinstate that contact. So they said things to me like, even when I was screaming at that person, don't ever darken my doorway again, I hate you, you're disgusting, you're despicable, you're garbage. Even, for example, the girl who said, oh, you're like an old watch, I'll just throw you out. They said to me, the people I interviewed, I didn't really mean it. I didn't really want them to go away. And I think that's one of the most important lessons from those interviews I did, is that we cannot take at face value what these kids are saying. I'm not saying they don't believe it in the moment, but there's levels of consciousness. There's degrees of believing something. And I don't think there's any reason to conclude that even the most vehemently rejecting child has no love for that parent or no care or really thinks they're an old watch that you can throw out. So I guess that's what I have to say about that. Okay, a question was asked about whether normative parenting is considered sufficient for a case to be a hybrid. And again, this really depends on what we're talking about. I think the person gave the example of harsh parenting, name-calling, yelling, and demeaning. And I guess I would say it depends on how often. We all are a little harsh sometimes. Maybe we say things that are a little demeaning sometimes. But if somebody is actually engaging in harsh parenting, name-calling, yelling, and demeaning on a regular basis, that is, in my opinion, that is not normative parenting. That's actually psychological maltreatment. So name-calling and yelling and demeaning are inappropriate, in my opinion. Behaviors for parents can be very damaging to children, and I would not consider that normative parenting unless it was at a very low level and very infrequent. And again, I'm not commenting on any one particular person's situation because I don't know. And also, again, you want to take into account the behaviors of all of the parties. Okay, there were several questions that people asked about documentation. How do I prove that it's alienation? What documentation do I need? So I did want to mention that, a lot of the alienating behaviors, a lot of this may be going on, and not all of it is documentable. I don't know if that's a word, but you know what I mean. You can't document everything. And different people need different levels of documentation. So, for example, for your attorney, when you're just describing to your attorney this is what's going on, how do I approach it? You probably don't need objective documentation for everything. Your attorney needs to know what's going on in the full sense. Likewise, for your personal therapist or talking to your friends and family, you can just say, this is what's happening. But for the court, for custody evaluations, writing affidavits, expert witness case file reviews, that level of person, you do need a different level of evidence. And the way that I think about it is this concept of level of evidence is really about how objective your evidence is. And there's levels of objectivity. So, for example, if you take bad-mouthing for an example, the least objective would be if you say, I believe my ex is bad-mouthing me to the kids. So that's obviously completely subjective. Better would be if you heard it yourself. Even better would be if a friend or family member heard it and was willing to testify. Even better is if a neutral third party heard it and was willing to testify. And then the best, highest level would be if you have it on tape. So you could go through each of the four factors, and this is what I recommend to people when they're trying to put together their evidence for a custody evaluator or for the courts or an expert witness file case review, is you get a binder and you have a section for each of the four factors, and it would be what's the evidence that you have what's the evidence that you had a prior positive relationship with your child, photographs, affidavits from people who can attest to it. The more neutral, the better. Then the second factor, absence of abuse or neglect. If there have been any child abuse investigations, you would put the findings there. Evidence that the other parent is engaging in alienation behaviors. Have a tab for each of the 17. Get your best evidence there. Evidence, the fourth tab would be evidence that your child's engaging in these 8 behavioral manifestations. Have 8 sub-tabs. Get your best evidence there. And think about it as level of evidence. The more objective and verifiable, the better off you're going to be. Somebody else asked why the courts don't understand about parental alienation. Actually, several people asked about this. And I'm just going to offer some thoughts about this. I'm sure other people have other ideas. I'd be happy to hear them. So the first is obviously lack of training. This is still somewhat of a new field, and, if somebody's a judge now, they probably went to law school 30 years ago, maybe even longer, and there were no courses in law school. I don't even know if there are courses now or legal trainings now that are widespread. So there really is insufficient training of lawyers and judges. That's why people need expert witnesses, because if all the judges were trained on it, you wouldn't need somebody like me to come in and go through the 4-factor model. There's misunderstandings in the field about what parental alienation theory actually says. For example, that not all rejecting children are alienated, or that abused children should be forced to reunite with an abusive parent. So there's all sorts of misunderstandings out there that can confuse the courts, the judges and lawyers about what alienation is. I think there's fear on the part of a judge, so they may understand it, but they still don't so they understand what alienation is, I should say, but they may not understand why they should do something about it. They might still think something like, well, sure, this is alienation. I believe that alienation exists. I even believe it's happening in this case. But then a judge can say one of two things. Either, but the kids are doing well, so why rock the boat? It can't be harming them. They're doing great. Or the judge can say, yes, I believe alienation exists. I believe it's happening in this case, but the kids aren't doing well. I can't rock the boat. So there's a built-in excuse, if you will, for not taking action. And one of the things that I do in my training and in my expert witness work is I will go through with the court the 11 reasons why the court should intervene. because that's the part that they really don't understand. And I may even have time in the talk today. If I do, I will go through those 11 reasons at the end after I've gotten through all the questions, because I see my job when I'm doing expert witness work or when I'm doing legal trainings is not just to explain the four-factor model, not just to convince them that it's real and how to detect it, but why they should do something so that they feel that doing nothing is worse than doing something. The next reason the courts don't get it right about alienation, I mentioned the hybrid model. It spreads the blame around. Everybody feels good. I've heard GAL say things to me like, well, when I'm done, if everybody's mad at me, I feel like I've done a good job. And, well, that's not really taking into account that in some of these cases, certainly in alienation cases, somebody's really doing something very, very harmful, and the other person is really, imperfect but a victim here. And you don't want to go into it thinking, I've done a good job if everybody's mad and disappointed. Then you're ultimately going to go down the path of finding every case to be a hybrid model. So it's not about how upset people are. That's not the right rubric. The question is, did I do what's in the best interest of the child? And that leads me to the final reason the courts don't understand or get it right, is that they have tremendous discretion to decide what is in a child's best interest. So probably everybody knows that there's a federal law that says that when two parents can't decide on the custody of a child, the judge has to decide based on what's in the child's best interest, meaning it's not about what the parents want, it's about what's best for the child. And every state has their own best interest of the child statute. And every state has a different list of factors. Some just have one or two. The most have 15 or 20 factors. And in most states, one of the factors is the child's preference. But I don't think there's any state where that's the only factor. But the problem is the statute doesn't tell the courts how to weight the the factors. So if let's say there's 15 factors in a state, the child's preference, whether the parents are abusive, continuity of school, how long the child's been in the current status quo, the mental health of the parents, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what is the judge supposed to do if the parents are, parent A is good on 7 of the 15, or let's say there's 14 factors just to make it even. Parent A is stronger on 7, and parent B is stronger on the other 7. There's no guidance. So it's not just that they don't understand PA, it's that they don't know how to weight these various factors to come up with the solution that would be truly in the child's best interest. So a couple other people asked, how do you convince the courts that, that it is alienation? And how do you, I'm trying to read this question here, what are the obstacles to getting the courts to accept alienation? That's what the question was. So I think I've actually already talked about this. It's about educating the judges. It's about getting proper documentation. Another problem that a lot of targeted parents have is that they make, sadly, a bad impression in court or to the custody evaluator. And I think that targeted parents definitely need some coaching before they have that first meeting with the custody evaluator. I'm always so sad when somebody comes to me for coaching and they tell me, oh, well, I've already met with the custody evaluator, and boy, that didn't go well. I feel like, oh, if only we had talked earlier. Because there's some very common pitfalls that targeted parents or common mistakes that targeted parents make that they are preventable, but they really are very impactful if this mistake happens. So the main one is that targeted parents often go into the custody evaluation sessions thinking that their job is to convince the custody evaluator that alienation is the problem. And they come in and they're anxious because they really have an agenda that they want to make it clear what's going on, and they might be kind of agitated, and they might be angry because they're being victimized, and it's totally understandable why they have all these feelings, but it tends to make a bad impression because the custody evaluator is really thinking not just about the words coming out of the targeted parent's mouth, but they're thinking about how they feel when they're in the room with this person. And oftentimes when the targeted parent is anxious and has an agenda, etc., the custody evaluator will think, gosh, I feel like this person's like just, too intense. They're too, angry. They're too agitated. They're just pushing this alienation theory on me. Ugh. No wonder the kids don't want to be with them. And so the mistake the targeted parents make is in not being self-reflective enough, not being nuanced enough in how they present things, not listening to the question. They're kind of always going off on these tangents. I know you're asking me about X, but let me tell you about this terrible alienation thing that the other person just did. And when they just keep hammering home alienation, 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 it often backfires. I don't know that many cases where the custody evaluator responds well to that. So a lot of these cases go badly because of mistakes that the targeted parent makes. And I'm not saying that they caused the alienation to begin with, because they didn't, but they inadvertently contribute to it. Somebody else asked about the long-term effects. What are the bad things that are going to happen to somebody who's alienated? And this is something I've thought a lot about. I've conducted, somewhere between 6 to 10 different studies on the long-term effects of alienation in this country and abroad with different samples, different measures. The results are always the same. The more exposure to alienating behaviors on the part of the child being exposed to these behaviors, the more likely that person as an adult is to experience depression, anxiety, general psychiatric symptoms, difficulties trusting people, low self-esteem, insecure attachment styles, difficulties becoming self-sufficient, on and on. And this is with different measures, different samples, different sampling strategies. And I think that if you want to understand more about this, probably the best place is just to read Adult Children of Parental Alienation Syndrome, Breaking the Ties That Bind, because that book not only lists them, as I just did now, but goes into detail. Why is alienation associated with depression, for example? Why is it associated with difficulties trusting people? So, again, it goes into it in a more, a thoughtful, deep way than I have an opportunity to now. Now, this doesn't mean that every adult child of alienation is going to have all of these symptoms. It doesn't mean that they're going to be dysfunctional in every way possible. I don't want anybody to feel alarmed. It's not a good thing. It is a very, very bad, damaging thing to do to a child, to alienate them. But I don't want you to feel like just because generally the research shows that alienation is associated with all of these things, that your particular child is going to have each and every one of these disorders. Okay. There's also a question about whether a parent will get their child back. I think they asked very poignantly, will my child ever come back to me? And that was actually the impetus for my first study. That was the question that I wanted to answer. That's the study that turned into the book, Adult Children of Parental Alienation Syndrome. And the answer is absolutely some children come around. And we're talking here about kids who weren't lucky enough to go into a parental alienation treatment program like Linda Gottlieb's or like Family Bridges of Richard Warshak's program. So we're talking about absent being in a program, which is obviously the best way to have your kid come around because they're going to be younger and the process will be faster. But if your kids are over 18 or they're under 18 and you just don't have the ability or opportunity to go into a program that's a parental alienation immersion program, there is still a chance that your kid will come around. There are ways to increase the likelihood that this will happen, and that's really the focus of my coaching practice, is helping parents increase the likelihood that their kid will experience them as safe, loving, and available, even in the absence of going through a parental alienation immersion program. Somebody else asked a related question, which is, what was the percentage of kids who come around once they're in college? And gosh, I wish I had the answer to that question, but I don't. We really don't have any epidemiological data on the percentage of kids who become alienated, the percentage of kids who come around. That would take an enormous amount of time and money and resources, and there just isn't the support to do that kind of research. So I don't know the answer to that, but I do think that college does seem to be an ideal venue for kids coming around and reconnecting, and that's because, as I mentioned earlier, the teenage brain is becoming more mature at that point. So the years between 18 and 22, a lot of growth is happening in the prefrontal cortex, which is the seat of reason, and there's less influence of the amygdala, which is the gut reaction, emotional decision-making. So it would make sense that a child would be able to have some cognitive distance to say to him or herself, maybe it's not exactly what I thought. And then, of course, there's geographic distance. If the child is lucky enough to live away from home, when I hear that, I always say, yes, that increases the likelihood. That's a good thing when a kid lives away from home in college. Also, in college, kids are meeting new people. And somebody who hasn't been sort of part of the whole alienation dynamic at home might be able to say, have a little bit of distance and say to the college student, you don't talk to your dad because of what? That doesn't sound quite like making sense. And then another thing that happens in college is the kid might be taking psychology courses. They might be thinking about themselves in a different way. So all sorts of good stuff happens in college, but I can't tell you what the percentage is. So there were many, many, many questions about countering alienation. And, of course, this really does depend on the age of the child, the severity of the alienation, and many other contextual factors. This is really the bulk of my coaching, and I can give a couple pointers here. They may or may not apply to any one situation, and I can't say I would recommend them carte blanche because a lot of this is situation specific. But this is what I have to say in general. Avoid arguing with their child about their beliefs. If a child accuses you of something, whether it's right or wrong, do not say, how dare you, blah, blah, blah. Who told you, blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah isn't true. How could you say that? That's a lie. That's a lie. All of those responses are completely shaming and distancing and unhelpful. And I totally understand the thought process of the targeted parent. It goes something like this. My child thinks X about me, and that's why he's so upset. X is a lie. If I can convince my child or show my child that X is a lie, my child won't be upset with me anymore. And, of course, that makes sense in a rational way, but it doesn't make sense for alienation. And so what I recommend, if your child accuses you of something, and let's take the example, you stole my college money, because that seems to happen so frequently. If a child says to you, you stole my college money, don't say, how dare you say that, who told you to say that, or that's not true. What you do instead is you follow the 5-step procedure. Step 1 is gratitude. This is where you say, thank you so much for telling me you think I stole your college money. I really appreciate knowing what's going on in your mind. It's easy to complain about somebody behind their back. It takes courage to look somebody in the eye and tell them what's bothering you. And I love you so much. I always want to know when you're upset with me. That's how relationships get better. That's how we work through stuff, is when you tell me to my face what's bothering you. So that's step one. And it really puts the relationship, just that one step, it just turns everything around. So instead of arguing with your child and creating a bad feeling where the child thinks, oh, all dad does is yell at me, or all mom does is tell me I'm wrong, the child's like, what? It really kind of shakes them out of their routine, negativity. Step two is compassion. And that means paying attention in the moment to your child's emotional expression. Are they saying, you stole my college money with anger? Are they saying it with confusion? You stole my college money? Or sadness? You stole my college money. That means paying attention to their facial expression, their posture, their tone of voice, and reflecting that back. And this is really hard because your kid is attacking you, right? They're yelling at you or telling you in one way or another that you're bad, you're stupid. And when we're attacked, it's hard for us to be compassionate. Like the compassionate part of our brain shuts down. When we're attacked, we go into, fight or flight or freeze. So I often advise people to take a couple deep breaths and then say to your child, no wonder you're so, whatever the feeling is. Let's say it's anger. No wonder you're so angry. You think I stole your college money. Man, you are so mad at me right now. Your arms are crossed and your face is showing me how intense you feel. I can hear it in your tone of voice. You are really mad. So it's really reflecting back what the child is sharing with you. Even if it's negative towards you, if you can share the emotion, you can connect in a deep way to your child. It's a paradox. The targeted parent thinks the way to connect is by telling the child how wrong they are for having that thought. But the real way to connect is by going into their pain and looking at it from their point of view. Step three, so the first is gratitude, the second is compassion, the third is empathy. That's where you imagine what it would be like to have that thought that your child has and to really kind of reflect on it. So you would say something like, I think I would be pretty mad if I thought my mother stole my college money. I would be thinking, what's the deal? How am I supposed to pay for college now? What's going to happen to me? Don't you care about me? Where'd all the money go? Why couldn't you, why'd you have to go on all those vacations? Why weren't you saving for my college? How did you just get that money? So it doesn't mean that you think that you're bad or you're not necessarily admitting that you did these things. You're just wondering what it would be like to be somebody who thinks that their parent did those things to them. You're showing your child, I care more about your emotional state and your thoughts and feelings than I do about correcting the record or preserving my reputation. That how dare you think I did this is so distancing. And this is like very, very, very different. Okay, so step 4, and let me pause for a moment and say step 1, step 2, and step 3 should be about 5 or 6 sentences each. You can't just race through them like, thanks, no wonder you're mad. I'd be mad too, because you're not going to have a shared emotional experience with your child if you're going at that pace. It's really about slowing down and really being thoughtful and careful in how you're relating to your child in that moment. Step 4 is the part everybody wants. This is the correction, but you get one sentence, and there's 2 different versions. So if the accusation is 100% false, you simply say, honey, that didn't actually happen. That's it. And you have to say it with no ego and no agenda, no urgency. That didn't happen, and let me show you, and I've got the papers, and the minute you go off into that urgent, I've got to prove I'm right and you're wrong, you're off track. It's very much low-key. That didn't actually happen. Now, if the accusation is subjective, a classic one being, you never listened to me, or you always yelled at me, you can't say that never happened. It's subjective. What you can say is, I thought I was listening, or I don't remember yelling. I didn't think I was yelling. So you're correcting the record, but you can't tell somebody, if one of the accusations is like, you never cooked food I like, you can't tell them you did too like it. You're not inside their taste buds, right? You can just say, I thought you liked the food. And then step 5 goes right back to compassion, where you say, but I hear you right now saying you believe this. And that's all that matters. It's very hard to let go of the idea that you're being falsely accused. And it's very hard to find this middle path between, if you think it's true, it must be true, so I'm going to admit I did this thing, which I don't think I did, versus how dare you say this. But the third path is being interested in your child's experience. And that's what will help you avoid conflict and will help you feel closer to your child. Okay, then there was just a couple additional questions, and I'm actually going to end about 10 minutes early. So somebody asked about whether I'm going to be at AFCC this year, and the answer is no, so sorry about that. And then a couple people asked about restoring family connections and how much it costs and what the mechanisms or mechanics of it are. So restoring family connections is RFC, first of all. That's sort of the initials. RFC stands for Restoring Family Connections. This is not a parental alienation immersion intensive program. This is not Family Bridges. It's not Turning Points for Families. So somebody might have misunderstood, but it's not a program for severely alienated kids. This is a program I created to fill a different gap, which, from what I could tell, there was no program out there for kids who are moderately alienated or for adults who come around, they realize, gee, I want to reconnect with that parent, and the parent's so happy, like, oh, my God, my long-lost kid wants to reconnect with me, but there's no real program to support them in that reconnection process. And so what I did was I created this 13-week program. I do not run it. I'm not a licensed mental health professional. I just created the manual for it. So any licensed mental health professional can get the manual. It costs $100. You can get it on the website. And I do offer consultation and some supervision and training for the clinicians. But it's a voluntary program. There's no court order. Everybody's over 18. That's for the adults. For moderately, that's a separate story. But primarily it's for adults. It's not an immersion program. It's outpatient, an hour a week for 13 weeks. And there's no special fees. It's just whatever the therapist charges, that's what the fee would be. There's no additional fee on top of that. And on my main website, which is www.amyjlbaker.org, on the home page, there's a little blurb that says something like, Dr. Baker is pleased to announce with colleagues that she created this program. Click here for more information. If you click there, it will take you to the Restoring Family Connections website, where you can read more about the program. You can find providers who have already bought the manual and been trained by me. You can buy the manual yourself. And, of course, if anybody has any questions, you can just email me. My email address is also on my website, and it's amyjlbaker@aol.com. And I think I'm pretty much done the content that I was going to present. So I'm going to thank Elaine. I don't know what happens next. I think I'll just stay on to make sure that I'm transitioning out. I hope that the content is helpful. And take care, everybody.